Lord be with you. A reading from the Sophia of Jesus Christ. And I just want to remind us that today is the third Sunday of the month, so it's going to be an extended homily, question and answer discussion, so pay attention to the reading. There's a quiz at the end of it. Okay. After Jesus rose from the dead, his 12 disciples and 7 women continued to be his followers and went to Galilee onto the mountain called Divination and Joy. When they gathered together and were perplexed about the underlying reality of the universe and the plan and the holy providence and the power of the authorities and about everything that the Savior is doing with them in the secret of the holy plan, the Savior himself appeared, not in his previous form, but in the invisible Spirit. And his likeness resembled a great angel of light. But that resemblance I must not describe. No mortal flesh could endure it, but only pure and perfect flesh, like that which he taught us about on the mountain called of Olives in Galilee. And the Savior said, Shalom Aleichem, my peace I give to you. And they all marveled and were afraid. The Savior laughed and said to them, what are you thinking about? Why are you perplexed? What are you searching for? Philip said, for the underlying reality and the plan. A gospel inspired by God.
Praise to you, Lord.
I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. It's the Feast of Pentecost. So I'm going to talk about Pentecost through the ages. And the second point, I'm going to try to unpack this very interesting gospel called the Sophia of Jesus Christ. So we're going to talk about Sophia and the underlying reality and the plan. And then the third one, I'm going to talk about lilies, flowers, and such-ness. Got that piece? Such-ness. Lilies, flowers, and such-ness. Okay. So it's a word. In German, it's a word, definitely. Yeah. In philosophy and theology, it's a word as well, but you don't hear it used a lot. Such-ness. The isness of something. We have it in our Eucharistic prayer. The isness. So, first point then, I want to look at Pentecost through the ages, because we think that Pentecost is peculiar to Christianity, but it's not. The notion of Pentecost goes way, 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 way back. And the first notion of Pentecost, in my opinion, actually we find in 10,970 BC. Any idea what happened in 10,970 BC? It was the flood, exactly. The flood was 10,970 BC. We know precisely when the flood happened by looking at Sumerian accounts of the flood and by kings' lists that we found in thousands of steles and clay tablets from Sumeria and Babylon. So we can precisely say when the ancients claimed the flood happened. And it's almost 13,000 years ago. 17 more years, it'll be 13,000 years to the last flood. So the last flood, the flood was 10,970 BC. So this is the time, allegedly, of Noah. And it's very, very interesting. When the flood finally subsided, after God had wiped out all of creation, except Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their wives, 8 people, and all the animals in the ark. After God had wiped out everything, God made the very first covenant. The first covenant was not with Abraham, or it wasn't with Moses, and it wasn't with Jesus. The very first covenant was made with Noah. But when you read through chapter 9 of the book of Genesis, here's what it says about it. God says repeatedly, about 9 times in that one chapter, God says, I now make a covenant between myself and all living beings. The first covenant is not between God and a chosen people, like the Jews. It is not between God even and humans. It is a covenant between myself and all living beings. So the very first covenant was made between God and all living beings. So that, in some senses, that is the first outpouring, that God is now going to bless all flesh. All flesh are going to be sons and daughters of his. Not just human flesh, but all flesh. For me, that's the very first Pentecost, the outpouring of Spirit and then blessing on all beings. God has repented, and God is never again going to wipe out all living beings. So for me, that's the first Pentecost. The second Pentecost happened with Moses. Moses thrived about 1250 BC. And we actually get the term Pentecost from Moses, as we get the term Passover. So Pentecost was the fulfillment of the Passover and the Exodus. And here's how it happened. When the Israelite slaves escaped out of Egypt in the Exodus, they called that the Passover. God passed over the houses of the Israelites and killed the firstborn of all the Egyptians, man and beast alike. So already God is kind of reneging on his promise to Noah. He's now killing human flesh and animal flesh as well. So, but the first part of it is called the Passover. And they escape from the land, and within 40 days, they reach Mount Sinai. And Moses goes up Mount Sinai and has a dialogue with God. And the result is God makes a new covenant with Moses. He gives him a constitution for this group of escaped slaves. And the day that happened was Pentecost. And it's, the name itself goes back to that time. It was not invented in the New Testament. So Pentecost was the celebration of the constitution of the new people, where the Passover was the celebration of their escape from slavery. They were slaves still for the first 40 days. Now they become a nation. They have a constitution. They have a new covenant with their divinity. And it's the Feast of Pentecost. And it's called that in the Mosaic literature. So there's the second reference to it. The third reference, fast forward another 800 years, to about 400 BC, to the time of Joel. And Joel will be quoted this morning in the Acts of the Apostles by Peter. Joel tried about 400 years before Jesus, and he made this prophecy. He said, "In the days to come, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh." So now Joel is going back to the Noahic covenant. It's not just on human flesh. It's not just on Judaism, not just on a chosen people. I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, everything that is alive. And he says, and he was very, very specific, he said, "Your young men will see visions and your old men will dream dreams." Now, this is not to say that the young people will have kind of ecstatic experiences and that the old guys only have dreams of what might have been. In Hebrew, the word dream and the word vision are exactly the same word. They're synonyms. Dreams are simply visions you have when you're asleep, and visions are dreams you have when you're awake. It's the same word in Hebrew. And so there are two modalities in which God speaks powerfully to us. In visions while we're awake, and dreams while we're asleep at night. So when he says, "Your young men will see visions and your old men will dream dreams," he's not discriminating and saying the good guys get the visions and you old guys, you just have dreams. It's exactly the same thing. They're ways of encountering the divine. "I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. Yea, I will pour out my Spirit even on the slaves as well as the free, on the females as well as the males." So there's going to be no discrimination whatsoever. Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, old people or young people. God is saying, "I pour my Spirit out on all flesh," and not just all human flesh, on all flesh. So now Pentecost goes right back again to the first covenant that God made with planet Earth. The fourth one comes then in the teaching of Jesus. The fourth Pentecost comes with the teaching of Jesus. And this is, Jesus' conundrum is that he's trying to impress ineffable teaching on a very dumb audience. And so he's stuck with words. No matter how much he tries to give them an experience of the Father, they're totally stuck, in their dumbness. And so he employs all kinds of techniques. Mainly, he eschews kind of theological parlance and philosophical terminology and scientific words. He speaks in parables. And when he's challenged about this in Matthew's Gospel, in two different places, they ask him, "Why don't you speak plainly to us? Why are you always speaking these ridiculous stories of yours?" And he said, "I speak in parables so that seeing you may see and not understand, hearing you may hear and not comprehend." So why would he speak in such a way that you can see but not understand, or hear but not comprehend? Because Jesus, like a good Zen Buddhist instructor, is trying to appeal not to the intellect. He's trying to transcend intellect, and he's trying to engage the soul. The second time, in the same chapter of Matthew's Gospel, he's asked, "We complained about this before. Why are you still speaking in parables?" And he said, this time, "I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world." In other words, only the language of art or music or mythology or storytelling, they're the only ways you can convey the real deepest meanings. You can't do it in philosophy or theology or science. You can't really do that. You can only connect with the physical world in those modalities. But no matter how hard he tried, they didn't get it. Right up to the very end, they didn't get it. And so Pentecost was necessary. And in Pentecost, what happens is the Spirit of Jesus, or the Spirit of the Father, or the Spirit of the source, engages the apostles at the soul level. It's not that they're being instructed in some new way with different terminology that they finally grok, or different words that they finally understand. It's that in the Pentecost event, Christ, or source, was able to go straight to soul and impregnate their understanding at a totally different level. So this is what Pentecost looks like in Christ's teaching. Now in the New Testament, you have two totally different versions of Pentecost. We think that the Pentecost is the story where 50 days after he rose from the dead, Jesus sent the Spirit down on everybody. Luke is the only person with that account. Luke made this up. You don't find it in Matthew's Gospel, you don't find it in Mark's Gospel, and John has a totally different version. In John's version, Pentecost and resurrection happened on exactly the same day. When you read John chapter 20, what happens is this. Jesus rises from the dead. He appears in the upper room where they're all hiding because they're afraid. And he says to them, as he said today, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. And then we are told, he breathed on them and he said, receive the Holy Spirit. So right then and there, according to John's Gospel, Pentecost and resurrection are the very same Sunday. Luke, however, has a different agenda. He's got a different perspective. Where John is standing in New York, Luke is standing in California. And Luke has a different idea. So Luke divides it up like this. Jesus dies. For 3 days he's dead. He rises on the third day. He's been seen by his apostles for 40 more days. Then he ascends to heaven. And then 10 days after he ascends, Pentecost happens. So Luke is trying to go back to the Mosaic version of the connection between Passover and Pentecost. So he's creating an artificial divide. He's creating 3 days dead, 40 days before Ascension, and 10 days after Ascension before Pentecost. And he's using these numbers symbolically, and he's harking back to the Mosaic model, because he's standing in a different location, describing the same phenomenon from a different perspective and with a different purpose, whereas John situates both of them together. Now, what about the church since then? The church, has lost sight of this, and we still we emphasize the Pentecost event as just a one-off event that happened 10 days after the Ascension, and we think that everybody spoke in tongues, Peter spoke in tongues. So there's quite a quick history of how Pentecost evolved in the Scriptures and early Scriptures. That's my first point. Second point now, I want to try to unpack this very, very interesting and esoteric teaching called the Sophia of Jesus Christ. And let me give you just a little bit of context to it. This document was discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. Among the Nag Hammadi scrolls, a whole bunch of material was found in 1945 in caves in Egypt. And the document itself that was discovered, the actual parchment goes back to the 4th century. And it's written in a language called Coptic. But in actual fact, much earlier, in 1896, there were other fragments of this document, but they didn't realize it at the time until the 1945 find. There were other fragments of this document found at a place called Oxyrhynchus, which was a monk's grave. Literally a whole bunch of material was buried with a particular monk at Oxyrhynchus. And that's where we find, for instance, the Gospel of Mary of Magdala in that grave. But there was also pieces from this Sophia of Jesus Christ. And those pieces were written in Greek. So we know that the Coptic was actually a translation of the Greek. So the Greek version goes back at least to the 3rd century, and some scholars will claim maybe even to the 1st century. So what we just read today is a very, very ancient document. And basically it's a story where after his resurrection, 12 disciples and 7 other women who were the followers of Jesus, they meet him on a mountaintop in Galilee. And the entire document, it's not that long, is a conversation, it's a Q&A between Jesus and his followers. And they ask him 13 questions, and he gives answers to 13 questions. And basically the questions are about the origin and the purpose of the gods and the angels and the universe itself. And at the beginning of the story, we read it today, on their way, they're standing on the mountain waiting for the Lord to come, and they're trying to figure out, what is the underlying reality of the universe? That's exactly the phrase used. And what is the plan? And they're trying to make sense of it all. And Jesus appears to them, and they're scared first because they don't fully recognize him. He's not in his normal form. He's like a great angel of light, so they're kind of overpowered and intimidated a little bit. And he starts laughing at the reaction. And he says, guys, what are you thinking about? And what are you looking for? Why are you perplexed? What's going on? And in fairness, Philip stands up and he says, here's what's happening. We want to know the underlying reality and we want to know the plan. Two basic issues. We want to know the underlying reality and we want to know the plan. So that's the document. That's the kind of the background to the document. So let me just unpack those two pieces then. What is the underlying reality and what is the plan? So the underlying reality is how we understand the world in which we find ourselves. And humans have engaged, it seems to me, in three different versions of this. There's what I would call the philosophical scientific version of it. There's the theological religious version of it. And there's a spiritual mystical version of it. And they're all trying for the same thing. They're all trying to understand the underlying reality. Philosophy and science does it by depending completely on the sensorium and the intellect. You make observations, whether you're a philosopher or a scientist, you make a whole bunch of observations using your senses and instrumentation, and then through cognition, you try to see patterns and identify laws in it. And so the underlying reality, as far as the scientist and the philosopher are concerned, is the use of the sensorium and of the intellect to try to arrive at ultimate truth. Theology and religion have a different approach. Theology and religion are trying to do the same thing that science and philosophy are doing. They're trying to infer the underlying reality, its meaning and its laws, but they're dependent upon revelation and faith. Whereas science and philosophy are using the sensorium and the intellect, religion and theology are relying mainly on revelation and faith. So they take the scriptural traditions and they believe that all the truth is contained there and we must try to figure out what it's telling us about laws. So there's not much emphasis on the sensorium and not much emphasis on the intellect. We're trying to figure out from the wisdom tradition that we were brought up in, whether it's the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, or the Quran, we're trying to make sense of it based on the revelation we've received as ultimate truth and using faith to connect up with it. The third effort is very different. The third effort is the way in which mysticism and spirituality go about this task. And in my opinion, they do it in the following fashion. They look to the sensorium and they look to the intellect. And indeed, they take the scriptural traditions as the wisdom offerings of people who preceded them, and they make an active trust and faith, that this represented some level of understanding of these ancient peoples. But they go way, way beyond it. They transcend intellect and they transcend sensorium by investigating through altered states of consciousness other ways in which ultimate reality addresses us. And when you learn how to shift your state of consciousness and you learn how to surf in different kinds of dimensions, you have encounters with different entities and different energies and different laws. And you bring those back and you cross-fertilize them with your intellect, your sensorium, the wisdom tradition, and the faith, and you arrive at a much, much deeper understanding of what ultimate reality is. So this is the question they're asking, and these are the ways in which we might go about finding this. So that's my response to that piece of it. What then does the plan look like? So if that looks like the underlying reality is that which is delivered by the sensorium, by the intellect, by the wisdom traditions, by faith and trust in it, but also by transcending intellect, going trans-rational, not irrational, but trans-rational, going trans-personal, not just personal. When we begin to discover and relate to the underlying reality, then we begin to understand what the plan is. And the plan, it seems to me, also exists at three different levels. There's an individual level to the plan, there's a global level to the plan, and there's a cosmic level to the plan. The individual level of the plan is what precise function am I meant to serve in this lifetime? What did I sign up for in this particular lifetime? And I try to address this in the last book that I co-authored, the book called Why. And if I were to just synopsize the entire book down to a single phrase, for me it would be this, that every person's individual mission is to breach the gap between ideals and values. And there's a big difference between ideals and values, in my opinion. Ideals are the navigational tools by which we would like to be able to live our lives, but values are the actual values. Values are the actual powers that drive our decision-making and our behavior. And I'll give you a graphic example I've used once before. In 1776, the founding fathers created what I regard as, one of the most extraordinary documents ever fashioned by human beings. If I had my way, it would be part of Scripture. The extraordinary, insightful document, part of which says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. that all people are created equal. This was an extraordinary and beautiful insight. It was an ideal, but it was not their value. Because the very same founding fathers who held this as an ideal and enshrined it so beautifully in this document, they kept slaves, some of them. Women did not have the vote. Black Americans were enslaved for another 100 years after this. And the very people whose continent we took from them are spoken of in that very document as savages. And so the ideal is that all men are created equal, but the value is, some people are born to be slaves. Some people are just born as women, and they don't even have a vote. Some people are, kids are just chattels, and the local population are just savages. It took us nearly 200 years to begin to telescope the gap between our ideals and our values. It took 100 years to free the slaves. It took longer still to give women the vote. And only very recently, perhaps in the last 30 or 40 years, are we acknowledging the extraordinary wisdom of the native peoples whose land we stole. And so it took us 200 years to try to telescope the gap between ideals and values. Now, in my opinion, we're going backwards for the last 20 or 30 years on that. I have real concerns about our Constitution and how it's being shredded right now, personally. But that's a separate discussion. So the gap between the ideals and the values is, I believe, is the individual mission. And I put exercises in this book to help you identify what your values are, the things that actually drive your behavior, and what your ideals are. And your unique mission, in my opinion, is to bridge that gap, to make your values and your ideals synchronize with each other, so that you're acting according to your ideals and not merely according to your values. So that's the individual mission. There's a global version to that mission. And the global version, it seems to me, is the ability to sequentially disidentify with lesser and lesser notions of the self, and to re-identify with greater and greater notions of the self. So just like, for instance, in your body right now, there are 50 trillion cells. 3.7 billion years ago, the only life form on planet Earth were single-celled creatures, protozoa of various kinds. Now, each of these cells is totally independent. Every cell has a brain, which is not the nucleus. You can take the nucleus out of a cell and will live for 3 months. The nucleus is not the brain of the cell. The brain of the cell is the membrane itself. Every cell has a brain. It has an elimination system. It has an endocrine system. It has a cardiovascular system. So every cell in your body has all of the components that your entire organism has as an organism. But at some stage, they decided to form communities. And these communities got together in more and more complex families, until finally there's a family called the human being, consisting of 50 trillion members in this family, all of whom have agreed, although every single one of them is independent in the sense that it continues to perform its unique function, but they've banded together originally in organs. A bunch of them have specialized as heart cells. A bunch of them have specialized as kidney cells. A bunch of them have specialized as brain cells. But then finally they subsumed a greater identity still, and their identity was the entire organism, all 50 trillion cells. Now, I believe that the next phase of our evolution calls for a meta-identification, where we don't identify just with this skin-encapsulated ego that I call Sean, but that we identify as the 7 billion members or the 7 billion cells on the human body. Now, I'm not talking about a one-world government with some oligarchy at the top. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the same kind of cooperation by which 50 trillion cells unite as an organism, although they retain their independence. I'm talking about that kind of an agreement where human beings see themselves as a family, and that there are no differences between eye cells or kidney cells. They're both vital to our development. It doesn't matter whether we're born in Africa or in Ireland or the United States of America, or what IQ I have, or what color my skin is. None of these things matter. We're all part of this body. And that's part of the global mission. But we have to extend even beyond that, because we're also part of all life on planet Earth. We share planet Earth with millions of other species of life. So our mother Gaia has given birth to all of these life forms, and because we come from the same mother, we're family. We're brothers and sisters. And so the identification with the planet itself and all life forms, that's the global aspect of this mission. And there's a cosmic aspect to this mission. The realization that even planet Earth itself is this tiny little speck on one little arm of the spiral galaxy, that we call the Milky Way galaxy, which in itself is one of 150 billion galaxies in this known universe. in what probably is a bubble bath of universes and metaverses. So at some stage, we're going to be invited to shift even our identification as being denizens of planet Earth with other brothers and sisters, the other species with whom we share the planet, into an understanding that we are brother and sister to all of manifestation. Wherever God has breathed life in any dimensions, they're sister and they're brother to us. So that for me seems that that's what the plan is. That's the underlying reality, and that is what the plan. So finally, I'm going to move into my third point. I call it from lilies to flowers to such-ness. There's a great story in the Hindu tradition about a father and a young son, a little boy about 5 or 6 years of age. And they're walking one day, and they see this huge big banyan tree. I don't know if you've ever seen a banyan tree. It's a gigantic tree. The branches loop down and kind of become roots again. So it's a huge, it looks like a forest. A single tree looks like a forest. And the little kid says to his daddy, "Daddy, where did this big banyan tree come from?" And the father says, "Let me show you." And he picks a fruit off it, and he has a knife, and he says to the child, "I want you to cut the fruit into two pieces." And the kid splits it down the middle. And the father says to him, "What's inside it?" And the kid said, "There's a little seed." And the father said, "Very careful now, I want you to cut the seed in half." And the little kid cuts the seed in half. And the father says to him, "What do you see inside there?" The kid says, "There's nothing there." And the daddy says, "You're absolutely right." And from that nothingness came this huge big banyan tree. And then he goes on with the famous phrase in Hinduism, "Tat tvam asi." Thou art that. That is what you are. That suchness, that isness, that core essence is who you are. When you really understand who you are, you're not your physical body, you're not your intellect, you're not your emotions, you are that. Tat tvam asi. There's a similar story told in Buddhism. In fact, the story says that the origin of Zen Buddhism in Japan was the following. That the Buddha at one stage was giving a homily. And he gave us a homily with not a single word uttered. Maybe you wish I do that sometimes. Not a single word. There's a whole group of his disciples watching, and they want to be taught. And he bends down and he plucks a flower and he holds the flower aloft. And they're watching. "Yeah, what are you going to say about the flower?" He said, "Nothing, absolutely nothing." And they're watching and watching. And all of a sudden, a guy called Makayapa begins to smile. He got it. And the Buddha looked at him and said, "You're awake. You got it." Because what this guy got was, he was looking at the suchness of the flower. He wasn't seeing petals, and he wasn't seeing a stalk. He was seeing the life source of which this was a manifestation. He got it totally. And would say, "Okay, now you're awake. You finally got it." And Zen Buddhism would go on to try to set aside all dogma and all creedal formulations and all mental concepts by creating these Zen koans which have no intellectual or no rational explanation or solution. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? And so the object of Zen Buddhism is to transcend mind completely and have direct experiences of suchness and source. Jesus came to exactly the same place. In this great story one time, he's walking along and he says to the disciples, "Look at the lilies of the field." Now we take this that he's talking about trust, and indeed he is talking about trust. He says they don't spin or weave or gather into barns, and yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his finery looked as good as one of these lilies. Why are you afraid? But there was, like every teaching of Jesus, there are several layers to his teaching, depending on how you can unpack it. So one level is just trusting the universe to provide for us. There's a much, much deeper level. When Jesus said, "Look at the lilies of the field," he was doing exactly what the Buddha had done. He was literally, in some sense, he had taken a lily and held it in front of him and said, "Look at it." Except that probably none of them got it. Maybe Mary Magdala got it. As they looked at the lily, maybe one or two of them really got it, what he's saying. That they really saw not just the lily, but the suchness and the isness and the essence. And then he would go on, and he would make the statement, later in John's Gospel, he's talking about the Father. And finally Philip says, in kind of frustration, "Lord, you keep talking about the Father. Show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us." And Christ says, "Ay, ves mir." "Philip, have I been with you all these years and you still don't know that if you see me, you see the Father? I'm in the Father, and the Father is in me. When you see me, you see the Father. When you see the Father, you see me." Now, Christ is not claiming a special relationship with Source. He's saying, I'm awake. Are you guys not awake yet? You know, you wouldn't be asking me to show you the Father. If you really saw me, you would really have seen the Father already. You would have gone beyond my physicality, you know, or my clothes or my accent or whatever, and you'd have seen the such-ness. You would have seen the isness. You would have seen the essence. And that is the same isness and essence of Father and Source. And so Jesus comes to the very same place. That's what the lilies mean as far as I'm concerned. Now, unfortunately, the church will take this once more and it'll turn, you know, the teaching back into dogma and creedal formulations. And so only the mystical core of Christianity will keep this alive. And the example I'd like to use, a metaphor, when I was growing up in Ireland, there were fires in Ireland, in the house, in the heart of the house, that had not been allowed to go out for hundreds of years, literally. So the mother, when the fire was built, at night time when everybody else had gone to bed, the mother was always the last one to go to bed, and there were turf fires, you know, peat fires. She would take the kinker, the ashes, the fine ashes, and cover up the embers, the glowing embers, insulate them. And the embers would remain alive through the night. And then the mother would be the first person up in the morning, and she would very, very carefully poke through the embers and then very gently blow on them. She wouldn't go, because there'd be a cloud of dust. She would go, so she's clearing the dust, and the embers come back into life, and she got the fire for this day. And she would add more peat to it. And that fire literally was not allowed to go out for hundreds of years when people lived in these little huts. Now, that is what the mystics and the Gnostics have done in Christianity and in all the religious systems. All the glowing embers of spirit are always covered over by the ashes of dogma and creedal formulations and rational thinking. And it takes the mothers, the mystics, to be able to tend the fire and to poke at it occasionally and to blow it gently and to bring the embers back into flames. That is the job of the mystics in every generation. But the church kind of clams down on that. And that's where we find ourselves now. And so what is the final message then I want to leave this morning before we open up to discussion? It is that it seems to me that our world, at least this time round, has gone through 4 phases, and we're being invited into the 4th phase right now. And the first phase happened maybe 50,000 years ago when we developed language and we began thinking about the existential questions. Who's responsible for all this? Is there some being who made us, who's our father somewhere? And so the first period of religion or spirituality was where people spoke about the gods. So this is the era of theology, when they spoke about the gods. At some stage, they figured out some kind of patterns to it. They could see patterns to nature and seasons to nature. So now they had a kind of a theology in place. They now begin the era of the priesthood, sacrifice and prayer, where they're not talking about the gods anymore. They're talking to the gods. And they're offering sacrifices to the gods, because now they want to try to placate them and, in some senses, manipulate the gods. So this is the era of sacrifice and prayer and priesthood. The third era comes with the notion that there are some designated people or some designated tribes who speak to the rest of us on behalf of God, and they call themselves the prophets. So here's an era now. They're not just talking about God or even talking to God. They're purporting to speak on God's behalf to the rest of us. And the 4th stage is the part we've been invited into right now, it seems to me. And that is not speaking about the gods, not speaking to the gods, and not speaking on behalf of the gods, but speaking as God. Realizing when the Buddha holds up the flower, that we really see what he's saying. When Jesus points to the lilies, that we really see what he's saying. And that with the Hindus we can say, Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. That is who you are. Not the little narcissistic ego, preening itself and thinking it's important, not that, but the essence, the core essence, which is the essence of God herself. And so ultimately, it is not where we look, it is how we look. If we don't know how to look, we can look everywhere and find nothing. When we do know how to look, we can look anywhere and find everything. And so you can literally sit in front of a California poppy, and if you know how to look at it, you've seen source. You can listen to a cricket at the fireside, and if you really, really know how to listen to it, you're listening to source. You can dip your feet in a little babbling brook in the forest, and if you really know how to feel, you're feeling source. Okay, guys. Patrice, then Tom. Just grab a mic there, love, so we can hear your question.
Sean, it seems to me that Pentecost actually encourages the concept of separation when actually we're of spirit and we don't need to have it breathed.
Can you say some more about that, Patrice?
We don't have to have it breathed into us.
Right.
We are that.
Okay.
And so it's interesting to me that the separation thing is right there.
Okay, interesting. So Patrice's comment was that in some senses, taking that as face value, Pentecost seems to kind of emphasize separateness because we have to be breathed into in order to kind of receive spirit. When, as you're actually pointing out quite correctly, that we're already spirit. So think of it maybe in this way, that the embers are already the fire, but that culture and upbringing has clouded over with the kind of the ashes, and that it takes some avatar to come, some mother mystic to come and just gently blow away the accretions and uncover what's already there. So she's not creating fire, she's uncovering that which inhibits the fire from showing itself. Great comment, Patrice. Tom and then Stephanie.
Yeah, I would almost like to continue with what Patrice said. A few homilies ago, you talked about avatars and Buddhas.
Okay.
And avatars, as I understood it, bring the word down from source. And the Buddhas look around where we're living and infer from that what source is like.
Right.
Maybe only one is really necessary. If Jesus was an avatar and Buddha was a Buddha, then either way will do it. I would think that somehow it'd be nice to meld the two. But I would just sort of like your comments about where we are and where to look.
Sure. Has everybody heard Tom's question? Yeah? Okay. So the interesting thing is that it's just a reenactment in a sense of the game that God plays herself. So, God can be experienced as a transcendent and as an immanent reality. There's an aspect in which we know that God is radically ineffable, that we can't say anything about God. That any attempt to describe God, which theology does and philosophy does to a lesser extent, any attempt to describe who God is doomed to failure. But God is. And we experience this God. We experience God in moments of, transcendent mystical bliss. So we have the experiences of God, but we can't articulate what those experiences are. As soon as we try to put them in words, words are like sieves. It just leaks out. The experience leaks out through the holes. And so we're in this game that God herself plays between her transcendent aspect and her immanent aspect. That aspect which can be experienced, and spoken of, and that aspect which is beyond language. And so in some senses, the avatars represent the infiltration of transcendence into immanence, and the Buddha represents the movement of immanence back to source. And together, I point out, they actually create this Star of David. So if the Buddha is a triangle pointing upwards, going back to source, and the avatar is the triangle pointing downwards, the revelation coming into human affairs, when you overlap these two, you get the perfect Star of David, if you position them correctly. And so the Star of David was just an emblematic understanding of this same notion, of the infiltrating revelatory aspect of transcendence into human affairs, and of the response of human beings from their immanence and their incarnation back into the understanding of their source. So we have to do this dance because we have agreed, we have contracted to incarnate. So we find ourselves in very limited circumstances with a tiny little laptop between our ears, forced to depend on the notion of a chronology, a time sequence, which actually doesn't exist in God space. There's only the eternal now. So we got all these limitations. So here's the limited incarnated version trying to go back and remember a source. And here's the source version, trying to give us clues, to draw us forward. In Hinduism, they have this beautiful notion of that the soul itself has two aspects. They call it Atman and Jiva. And so they use the example of two birds sitting on a tree, Atman and Jiva. Atman is that aspect of God, of soul that never incarnates. And Jiva is that aspect of soul that incarnates regularly. So they're sitting on the branch of a tree, and Jiva dips down and has an earth experience, pecking around at the seed on the ground and scratching in the earth, and Atman is just watching. And then at the end of the incarnation, Jiva goes back up and they sit side by side and they debrief. And Jiva says, here's what it felt like down, here's what the experience was like on the earth, here's what seeds taste like, here's what it feels like to scratch on the soil. And it shares the experience of incarnation. And Atman says, and here's what it looked like, when I could see you in this huge big context as part of an ecosystem. I could see the insects around, and I could see the flowers in the distance. Here's what it looked like for me. And they kind of debrief. And so what God is doing herself, the souls are doing, and the individual journey on planet Earth is recapitulating. So we live literally in a fractal reality in which the same pattern repeats at just different scales. It's repeating at the cosmic scale, at the global scale, and at the individual scale. And the avatar and the Buddha represent, that dance between transcendence and immanence. Stephanie was next, and then Lisa.
When the first reading was the Acts of the Apostle, I was thinking about the speaking in tongues, where people always interpret it so literally. And it seemed to me like the symbolic is that if you speak in your own language, I know, like from teaching English as a second language, the native tongue is always the language of the heart, which is the one that is closest to your heart, easiest to learn. So that they were actually showing that this teaching could be spoken to everyone, to their own heart, basically. The other comment, I've heard you talk about when the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was discovered in 1896, the significance of that date. What about, have you ever talked about 1945 when Nag Hammadi?
Yeah.
I mean, because that seems to me like that was the end of the World War, the atomic bomb.
Yeah,
I mean,
brilliant.
a lot of
Brilliant.
contrast that way.
Brilliant.
Do you have anything to say on that?
Yes. So Stephanie's question is this, that I'd spoken in the past, or she's heard me speak of the Gospel of Mary, which was discovered in 1896 at Nag Hammadi, and the significance of that for world spirituality. And she wonders if I've ever spoken about the great finds at Nag Hammadi in 1945 and the significance of that, because it represented the end of World War II, the dropping of the atomic bomb, the beginning of the nuclear age, in some senses. I have addressed that in past homilies. I don't know if they're videotaped or audio taped or whatever. I have addressed it, but it's worth making comments on. I'm fully convinced that every stage of evolution, every time we solve previous problems in the evolutionary trajectory, we sow the seeds of greater problems to be solved into the future. And this is not just that it's a kind of that God has a sick sense of humor, that we kind of never win. It's rather that evolution never stops. And so if we could ever reach a stage where we totally and finally solve all problems, all growing would stop on planet Earth. And so every time we solve an issue, we sow the seeds of a greater problem down the line. It may be 100 years down the line, 300 years down the line. So you can look at any human advance, writing, fire. Every time we solve a problem, so fire was necessary. We could cook our foods, warm ourselves, protect ourselves against animals. We turn that into a weapon of war, where we can burn people's food supplies. You take writing, calligraphy or orthographies, a great breakthrough that liberated the human spirit. It creates all kinds of abilities for people to propagandize and visit their, agenda on other people, like the mass media being owned by 6 different companies. So every time we solve a problem, we sow the seeds of the next problem. And that's not bad, that is good, because it means that the evolutionary trajectory has infinite possibility, and that our job is not to be overcome by the present level of conflict or the present level of the dysfunction. Rather, it's an invitation to become even more and more creative, more and more loving, so that we can continue to disempower corrupt leaders, dismantle dysfunctional systems, but manage to do it in a way which doesn't just add more violence to the god Moloch, the fire god of anger and greed.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
On the Mary of Magdala, when she addressed the disciples, and she talks about the fourth climate, I don't know.
The fourth climate?
The fourth climate.
Okay.
She talks about it's the 7 manifestations of wrath. And she talks about darkness, craving, ignorance, lethal jealousy, enslavement to the body, intoxicated wisdom, and guileful wisdom.
Okay.
Do you have anything to say on that?
I always have things to say.
And the other point is, Do you ever have any speculation on what was missing?
Let me extend on this. I'm kind of going way out on the limb at this stage. But I really, really believe that when I look at the extent of human violence and greed, part of me thinks, there's something beyond humans involved here. I can't imagine how anybody would be so sick that they would visit that level of distress and torture on another human being. And take one very simple case. From what I've read about it, I haven't read a whole lot about it, but this kidnapping, was it Ohio? Where this guy had kidnapped these 3 young women. And my understanding was that the last one that he captured was a 14-year-old girl who was his daughter's best friend. And he offered her a lift home and then subjected her to all kinds of rape for the next 7 or 8 years. But part of it was this guy was a musician, a part-time musician. He was playing in gigs to raise money to help the search to find where this girl was. And they were creating flyers, and he was bringing the flyers home, and he was taunting them with the flyers. He was even allowing them to watch television, to look at the reporting about their being missing and the search for them. Now, how sick is that behavior? Part of me thinks no human being left to their own devices is capable of that level of evil. So part of me at this stage, I'm convinced that there are non-physical, disincarnate entities who are much more intellectually advanced than we, who have continued to intervene in human affairs, and that they don't need physical food. They feed off distress and anger. So you take this list, you can add to that the 7 deadly sins. You can add to that any vice. There are beings out there who specialize in creating situations where they seduce people into that kind of behavior so that they themselves can feed off that level of negative energy. And so, if we can do it as human beings, where is it coming from? I can't, in my soul, I can't believe that left to their own devices, human beings are that sick, are capable of that level of pathology. There must be some beings out there, angelic beings doing the good, and demonic entities doing this kind of stuff that's actually seducing and creating situations of war and creating situations of conflict, because the energy generated in those kinds of situations is actually food for these beings. Jerry.
I've never heard you really talk about Lucifer and Ahriman. So aren't these exactly the guys that are out there doing this?
Totally. Absolutely. So Jerry's talking about Lucifer and Ahriman. So Lucifer is a kind of a Judeo-Christian notion of a kind of a principality of these evil powers. In the Zoroastrian belief system, there are 2 kind of warring factions. There's Ahura Mazda, which is the god of light, and there's Ahriman, which is the god of darkness. So you get this motif is played out in human affairs right throughout the centuries. So you can try to dismiss this and say it's mythology, but more and more as I think about this, and in fact I've done a lot of writing about this just in the last week, I am more and more convinced that there are different levels of energies and entities, and the fact that they're more advanced than us intellectually or technologically even does not necessarily mean that they're more spiritually advanced than us. And it really feels to me like there is some level of manipulation. I can't for the world imagine that we fill our skies with these death-dealing metal monsters that we call, intercontinental ballistic missiles, our drones, our fighter bombers, our nuclear capability planes, or that we fill our Earth with death-dealing metal monsters, like tanks and personnel carriers and Humvees, or that we fill our oceans with these death-defying metal monsters that we call cruisers or battleships or aircraft carriers, or that we, people the depths of the ocean with these death-defying metal monsters of nuclear submarines and sonic technology that the latest estimate is that there's an agreement. Some group in the government has given a license to the Navy to kill 11.7 million marine mammals in the next 5 years in order to experiment with underwater explosions, surveillance techniques underwater by creating sonic waves that are literally killing and maiming this. I can't for the life of me believe that any human being is that sick that left to their own devices, they would waste that level of resource while we deny kids food and elders Medicare in order to create that kind of... I can't believe that left to their own devices were doing this. For me, there's some other entity or some other entities that are orchestrating that conflict, in opposition to the angelic and the divine beings who are inviting us into love. So Lisa was asking a question a few minutes ago, and then Johanna.
I
Sorry,
had
yeah. Okay.
two comments, actually. One of them dovetails off of what Tom was talking about with avatars and why do you need more than one, that type of thing. And looking at spirituality and looking at what's happening in science and technology, we now have Google search and Google Maps, and it actually allows you at a desktop to sit up and you can view the world from a satellite picture and you can scale down, just like you were talking with Atman and Shiva, right?
Brilliant. Brilliant.
And what we also learned from Google is that all roads lead to Nebraska at some point, right? You know, from the tie in there. So it was like you can be in the four corners of the world and still get to the same place. But it also means there's different directions to do it. So we need that too. And I just think that technology can help us get to that point where, and actually I think it is driving us to the point that science is going to prove the existence of God. So that's the other side of enrolling belief. The other thing I wanted to look was when you talked about Genesis in chapter 9 and the first covenant that was made, there was also the covenant, the covenant of the waters will not cover the earth again. So looking at recent history, you've got the tsunami where 250,000 plus people were murdered and killed by it, not murdered but killed in that event. We have Katrina. And so I was looking at that. So it just seems like we are going in the wrong direction with climate change. And would this be proved wrong in the covenant? And then also, so it made me think, there's the covenant of God down, but there's also the covenant of community. And how we saw people respond to those events was the covenant of community and the spirit exchange, not just downward, but this way as well.
Great points, Lisa. The truth is that every revelation is mediated through human receivers, and so you can't ever say anything is gospel truth in the sense that it's undeniably, infallibly correct. Everybody who's a prophet is receiving information and disseminating it through their own understandings, their own fears, their own prejudices, and so even something like this, an understanding of the covenant, that's already mediated through a wisdom tradition with particular parameters. So it doesn't necessarily translate as the ultimate, ineffable, unavoidable future. The second thing I want to say in response to your first question is the technology piece, the application of technology. I agree totally with you. Technology can be put to extraordinary, benefits. But what really saddens me at this stage is what I call the trickle-down thinking, that just to take three areas, we have a trickle-down technology in which the big money goes to the military. And then a few years later, maybe it trickles down as, computers for us or iPhones or whatever. But the big money is always going into death dealing, for the military. That's trickle-down technology. There's trickle-down business models in which the corporatocracy is given social welfare through, tax breaks, while the little guys are being crushed into extinction. In the belief system that somehow, if you empower the rich even further, they'll create jobs for the rest of us. So that's trickle-down economics. And then there's trickle-down, theology. The notion somehow that if you just listen to the churches and the leaders, and do what they tell you to do, you'll become a spiritual person and you'll get to heaven. Instead, in fact, of, settling for nothing less than personal experience of the ineffable. So this trickle-down thinking has infiltrated all aspects. Yeah. Johanna was next.
The subject you were talking about right before this, about the fact that there are energies that can hang around and feed off of our negative emotions. It's kind of difficult to talk about, but actually I have had experience of that when I was younger. I went into somebody's house and I really felt a lot of very strange things. And I really felt that people were doing a lot of really heavy, bad drugs in there. And they were busted about 2 months later. They lived next door to me. So I understand what you're talking about. And I also remember that there's a little tiny book that long ago you had recommended to James and myself. And it talked about this, a man who had died. Do you know the name of that
Probably
book?
George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow.
Return from Tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, good.
Yes. Can you talk about
Sure.
that book? Because it kind of documents that. And then the second part is that talking about the Pentecost, if there, I've had experience with this type of things, but also when you're talking about, I just saw Star Trek, the movie. One can look at Pentecost too as that maybe there are, that light coming in front, maybe there are beings that are actually,
Yes.
giving us the capability of switching things on in our,
Right.
this kind of out there stuff, but
Right.
switching things on to help
Right.
us also.
So let me just make a response to both of those pieces. This guy, George Ritchie, wrote probably the first account of a near-death experience that I've read, at least, and one of the most powerful. He was a young soldier in 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, when, a whole bunch of young men, joined up to fight World War II. And he was in a boot camp in Texas with about 36,000 other, kids in Navy, Army, whatever. And there was an extraordinary outbreak of flu happened that year, and a whole bunch of people died, including George Ritchie. And he was dead for 90 minutes. He was brought into the morgue and had a sheet covered over him. He was only 19 years of age. And they came in to take away the body, and they noticed that, the sheet was moving over his nostrils. So they pulled him out of it, revived him completely. He went off to fight in the war effort, came back, became a physician, and became a psychiatrist. And he wrote this book called Return from Tomorrow, in which he described his experience during that 90-minute period. That's Earth time. Obviously, he's not stuck with Earth time. But one of the experiences he had, he said, was going into a pub or a bar near the base, which was, chock full of servicemen. And it was an old, pub with sawdust on the floor. And there's a hall was crammed full with people. But he said, I noticed there were two different kinds of people there. There were people who were kind of alive and vibrant, and they had an aura. And then there were these people who were totally like human beings, but there was no aura whatsoever, just totally flat. And he said, at one stage, there was this young serviceman with 2 pints walking across the floor, and he slipped and he fell, trying to hold on to the pints, and banged his head off the ground. And he said, immediately I saw his aura just shrink down to 0. And one of the other beings, the aura-less beings, invade him from the top of his head right down into it and occupy the space. And he said, that's my experience, that when our energies are weak, through any kind of addiction or an accident of various kinds, that there are entities, who don't have physical bodies anymore, but who are addicted in some way, so they need some kind of a medium to indulge their addiction. So that's kind of an example of what you're saying there. Your second question about the Pentecost event and this light in the forehead, it was interesting that in the gospel reading today, you had the same notion, that when Jesus appeared to the 12 disciples and the 7 women followers, we were told he did not appear in his previous form. He appeared like a great angel of light. And so in the journey from our physical articulation to a source, one of the stages we seem to go through is that we become light bodies, that the essence really is light. And so as we move back towards source, our self-expression is more and more thought-sensitive and less confined to physical articulation. Georgie, and then Pat. One second, just grab your mic.
I don't really
Do you have your question, Mark?
I just want to get your attention. I'm in the dark back here. You haven't seen me for the last 5 people.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll go to you next. Sorry, buddy.
For me?
Yes.
What you talk about learning about source. What can I do? What practical things can I do to learn about source? Can I knock you on a question?
Sure. Good. Let's go with that one, John. What practical things can we do to learn about source? Personally, what I find really powerful is to volitionally alter states of consciousness. So that means working with your dreams, spending time in nature, just watching what nature does, spending time with little children, getting into your imagination. Because I keep saying to people, imagination is not the faculty that allows you to make up stuff that's not real. It is the ability, to visit into different states of consciousness, interact with different entities, energies, and laws, learn from them, bring them back to this state of consciousness, and cross-fertilize, and therefore grow your model of reality. Meditation does it. So there's a whole bunch of spiritual practices that allow you, to experience source. Now, thinking does it for some people. I mean, I love to think about these things and create models, but I know that the models are they're only maps, they're not the terrain, but they help me kind of just, navigate a little bit so that the next time I go out, I know where I can go and where I, don't go. So where I'm going right now for myself, I'm spending more and more time asking this question of myself, or making this request of the universe. I'm asking every day, several times, I say, please let me speak with the guardians of Gaia so that I can be of assistance to my mother. So I really feel that there are angelic beings who are shepherding the planet at this stage, and I want to be in dialogue with them. I want to know how I can help in that process, because I'm really concerned about the health of my mother, the planet itself. So these are the kinds of exercises that might happen. Great. Mark, sorry buddy that I didn't see you. And then Pat.
The Declaration of Independence actually says all men are created equal.
Yes.
I suppose we could take that to mean mankind or all humans,
Yes.
but given the fact that these people had slaves and their attitudes at the time, isn't it just as likely that they meant not slaves, not women? And these people were politicians. I'm not sure I'd trust our politicians today to mean the right thing. So how could we assume that these were elevate these people to enlightened status?
Okay. For this reason, Mark, because I think the term man has a long history, particularly when you're translating from the Latin.
Men, not man.
Yeah, I get it. When you come from the tradition, from the Latin origins, and most of these guys would have been educated, be fluent Latin speakers probably. The word in Latin is homo, and homo does not mean a gay. Homo, it means the human species. So when you use the word man or men, very typically, you're indicating the species itself. So I think that at a really exalted level, at an inspired level, they knew in their souls that this is what was meant. In their day-to-day affairs and in their kind of politicking, they chose to unpack it differently. But I think that very often inspiration far outstrips practical application. It always does. Most of us a great artist will always produce something that they don't understand. So if you asked an artist, what did you mean by using that color or the others, she probably can't tell you. So she's been driven by some kind of an inspiration which is far ahead of her intellectual ability to unpack it. So my personal belief is that that's where these guys were operating from, and that they did manage to create a country, and a type of government that slowly was growing into that ideal, but that has begun to go backwards in the last few years.
This isn't really a question.
It's a what question?
It's not really a question. It's
Okay.
like a reaction.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Well, it kind of disturbs me when you talk about these evil
Okay.
beings, because I guess if I'm honest, I would say it's scary.
Of course.
But the other part is that it sort of seems like inventing an explanation that in a way goes back to like polytheism or something like that. When an explanation of evil, like being a twist in psychosis, or a twist in a characterological disturbance, or like there's research showing that some people are not stimulated very much by things that normally stimulate people, and that doing something evil or doing some violence is stimulating to them, and then the stimulation is exciting, and they get addicted to that. And that kind of explanation to me is also enough. So.
Good. That's great. I totally agree with you. This is your understanding, and this is how you're making sense of your experience. I have no quibble with that whatsoever. My experience is different, and therefore my explanation is different. So I don't take issue at all with you in saying there are many different interpretations of the data, and that if that one works for you, that's great. It doesn't work for me. I don't quite believe that talking about different warring energies is the same as polytheism. Ultimately, I'm totally convinced there's only one source, but that in the journey back to source from a dualistic, experience, we all experience life dualistically, we're separate from other people, that in that journey back, we encounter energies of various kinds. And for me, at this stage of my life, the most parsimonious explanation is that there are other energies, indeed, as there are in a sociological situation. No one human being is operating in a vacuum. We're all influenced by each other. And so if I were to say, for instance, I'm totally responsible for my own stuff, I am, the originator of my own genius, and I am the creator of my own sins, and there's nobody else influences me, that would be totally isolationist. So even sociologically, we experience that our growing and our retardation happen in social encounters. And if that's true at within the human family, it seems to me that it's true at every level of the hierarchy of this, and that there's interplay between different levels of hierarchy. We intercede with and we breed animals for our own purposes. We in turn, have parasites that feed on us. We have people, obviously through Schadenfreude, who take great, gaudium or great joy in watching our discomfort, or even causing our discomfort sometimes. So we're in a web of relationships and contact with each other. And I see this as a three-dimensional or a multi-dimensional set of relationships, not just a horizontal one. But your interpretation is a very, very valid one. So somebody who hasn't spoken yet, Mike. Wait for the mic.
In reference to what you just said, I have a friend going way back who became a Maryknoll missionary in El Salvador, and he saw real evil, and I won't even describe the things he saw, but I said, what is that like? And he started describing it. It was a physical reaction, cold wind, a frightening thing, and he's just in the presence of this guy. He said you could reach out and touch the evil. Now that doesn't prove anything, but it was the best description from him that I ever heard that something exists other than neurosis and psychosis.
Thanks, Mike. It's 11:15, guys. I know Nancy had her hand up who hadn't spoken yet, so I'm going to give you the last word, Nancy.
So much has been covered today. There's just a couple of comments. One has to do with spectrum. I mean, we're all aware of spectrum, and you spoke of the embers and the ashes. But one thing that I believe in are cultural underpinnings, yes. Things that we inherit and we're not even conscious of. And we all have come from a country that Christianity is violent, America is violent, if you look at the spectrum in worldwide cultures. And so those underpinnings, I think, and then we talk of all of us working very hard to become enlightened or more conscious. So when you have backward or narrow-minded people, you're wondering where on the path are they, and what effects are there. So many ashes, which are the cultural underpinnings, that the embers are not conscious in them. I'm really haven't asked a question, but I'm wondering if you could
make a comment on it. Sure, Levine. I agree that when you really look at the world situation, that we're born into a web of relationships. We're born with genetic material. We're born into a particular family. There are cultural norms. So we're born immediately into this entire system. We're not, free individuals with the ability to make our own choices independently of everything else. We're not. We come into this web. And when we look around our world, we could be forgiven for just losing hope and thinking, it's impossible. Personally, I'm totally confident that the journey that began in God's womb will end in God's heart. Now, I think sometimes there are going to be circuits, and we get caught in ruts and we repeat patterns, sometimes for hundreds of years, sometimes for thousands of years. But that ultimately the rut, becomes a three-dimensional spiral, where even if we visit the same issues, we're dealing with them from higher and higher levels. And at the core of my being, I know at the core of my being that this is not a lost battle. That if our generation doesn't do it, some other generation will. But that all I've done and all you've done is you volunteered to be here right now. You knew exactly what the field looked like. You knew exactly what the issues were, and you said, yes, send me down. So all you can do and all I can do is say, I'm going to give it my damnedest shot. We may still be losing the game by the time I exit this time, but the game is going to be won. Guys, I'm going to thank you so much for your patience and for your contributions. Thanks a lot.